Most people think the real danger begins when the war gets hot enough for the television to panic. I think that is much too late. The real danger begins when a crisis reveals how dependent the entire financial system has become on one thing continuing to happen forever. Somebody somewhere must keep funding the debt. That is the first thing I want to say. Not because war is not real. It is. Not because oil does not matter. It matters tremendously. Not because governments do not face impossible choices under stress. They do, but because the visible event and the invisible mechanism are not the same thing. The visible event is a war, a shipping lane, a presidential speech, a spike in oil, a fall in futures, a burst of headlines about retaliation and escalation. The invisible mechanism is the creditor grid. That is the mother line of everything I want to tell you. By the creditor grid, I mean the hidden web of balance sheets, reserve assets, wallets, debt markets, apps, central banks, Treasury buyers, and institutional channels through which the United States funds itself and through which the rest of the world, often without understanding the full game, finances that funding. If the creditor grid remains stable, the system can absorb extraordinary stress longer than most people think. If the creditor grid begins to strain, the war is no longer merely a geopolitical event. It becomes a monetary event. That is the difference. The source document you gave me begins with the immediate spark. A presidential speech turns more threatening. Oil rises, market futures wobble. And the Strait of Hormuz remains impaired enough that tanker traffic is visibly reduced. It then makes the leap from the shipping lane to the larger claim that if this disruption persists for weeks, the world could hit a breaking point where even an eventual ceasefire would not undo the damage quickly. Fe-Felicite, Fe-Turn 65, File 0 Fe, that is exactly how I would start thinking about it, not with the speech itself. With the lane, a lane carries more truth than a speech because ships either move or they do not. Oil either flows or it does not. And when a lane carrying something as fundamental as energy becomes impaired, the first order problem is easy enough to see. Fuel gets expensive, transport gets expensive, food gets more expensive because fertilizer, logistics, refrigeration, and everything around them absorb the shock. That is the first layer. The second layer is what interests me more. Who needs dollars? Now that is where the creditor grid begins. The source introduces a figure from Luke Groman, the net international investment position, which measures what foreigners own in us assets relative to what Americans own abroad. It says that this balance has become deeply negative, around 87% of GDP, and that foreigners now own enormous quantities of U.S. stocks, bonds, real estate, and especially Treasury debt. Fe-Felicite, Fe-Turn 65, File 0 Fe. That is not some academic footnote. That is the stage, because when foreigners own that much of your paper, two things become true at once. First, they help sustain your system by holding your claims. Second, they have the ability, under pressure, to sell those claims. That is the double edge of reserve privilege. People talk about reserve currency status as if it were just a gift. It is not only a gift, it is also dependency disguised as prestige. If the rest of the world is willing to keep parking its savings in your liabilities, then you can finance deficits much more easily than an ordinary country. But if the rest of the world suddenly needs dollars for survival rather than for portfolio management, those same assets can become the first source of emergency funding. And that is the moment the creditor grid starts humming loudly enough for anyone paying attention to hear it. The source says Europe, Japan, China, and much of Asia are especially exposed to oil moving through Hormuz. It then asks the right question. If they need dollars quickly to secure energy, where do they get them? The answer it gives is simple and brutal. They sell us assets, stocks, bonds, treasuries, whatever can be liquidated. Fastest, Fe-Felicite, Fe-Turn 65. File 0 Fe, that is exactly right. The first move in a real monetary stress is not philosophical. It is practical. Nobody in a funding squeeze asks what asset best represents fairness or democracy or the moral order of the world. They ask what settles. That is why I always tell people that the first draft of a crisis is written in obligations, not ideals. If an oil importer needs dollars now, it sells what it owns. Now that is where the creditor grid stops being abstract. It becomes a liquidation channel. And once that channel opens, the next layer appears, Treasury yields. The source says foreign central. Bank holdings of treasuries held at the New York Fed recently fell to the lowest level since 2012, and argues this is only the beginning if the pressure persists. It then identifies the 10-year Treasury yield as the critical bond to watch, and cites research suggesting a danger zone in the high 4% range where financing costs begin to push the system toward a debt-death spiral. Fay file cite Fay turn 65 file 0 Fay, that is not melodrama, that is arithmetic. A government with almost $40 trillion of debt is not fragile in the same way a household is fragile. It has a printing press, it has taxing power, it has reserve currency status, it has political and military reach. But once the interest cost begins compounding faster than the economy can comfortably absorb, fragility changes form. It becomes sovereign drag. The problem is not only that the stock of debt is large. The source says this too. The deeper issue is that debt is growing faster and faster, so a higher cost of financing does not just hurt the present, it accelerates the future burden. Fay file cite Fay turn 65 file 0 Fay, that is the real danger. A debt-death spiral is not a slogan. It is a loop. Higher yields mean higher financing costs. Higher financing costs mean larger deficits. Larger deficits mean more issuance. More issuance can mean even higher yields if the market demands compensation. That is how a creditor grid becomes a pressure grid. And pressure grids force choices. The source reduces the choices to three broad outcomes. Let yields rise and accept recessionary damage. Print money and cap the bond market at the cost of inflation, or back away geopolitically and accept the perception that American power no longer guarantees the monetary order it used to underpin. Fay file cite Fay turn 65 file 0 Fay, that triad is the heart of the whole source, because none of those outcomes is clean. That is why I find this moment so instructive. People keep hoping for a policy answer that preserves everything. Cheap debt, low inflation, high asset prices, global trust, military credibility, and no loss of domestic purchasing power. That is fantasy. When the creditor grid gets stressed, something has to absorb the pain. The question is only where. Now let us take the first path seriously, allow yields to rise on paper. That sounds like discipline. Let the market clear. Let bond buyers demand what they demand. Let the debt price itself. Honestly, very noble, very adult, until you follow the chain. Higher yields make government financing more expensive. They also make mortgages more expensive, corporate debt more expensive, commercial refinancing problems more acute, and equity valuations harder to justify because investors can now get more return from supposedly safer paper. The source says this is the path that crushes stocks, weakens housing, damages consumer spending, hits banks, and triggers a recession, severe enough that the broader debt problem worsens instead of improving. Fay file cite Fay turn 65 file 0 Fay, that is exactly the issue. People imagine the market solution as if markets solve stress cleanly. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they solve it by repricing everybody as life violently at the same time. That is not a gentle medicine. That is amputation. So path one is possible, but politically it is ugly. Governments do not usually choose the ugliest politically visible path if they have another option. That takes us to the second path, print. Now, when most people hear printing, they think of one thing. Money appears, inflation follows. They are directionally right and operationally sloppy. The source is smart enough to separate two kinds of quantitative easing. It describes the 2008 variety as balance. Sheet repair inside the banking system, and the 2020 variety is a much broader injection that flowed into the wider economy and, with a lag, fed a large inflation wave. It says printing into an oil shock now would likely look much more like the second type, only with energy prices already rising at the front end. Faithfully cite Fay turn 65 file 0 Fay, that distinction matters enormously. Not all printing is socially transmitted the same way. If the central bank merely swaps assets inside a sick banking system and the money stays there, the inflationary consequences can be more muted than people expect. But if printing arrives while commodities are already under strain, if money reaches the wider system, if the supply side is constrained, and if the public is still treating the dollar as settlement shelter, then the outcome looks very different. Then you are not only backstopping the bond market, you are changing the purchasing power of everyday life. That is why I think the second path is so tempting and so dangerous. It is tempting because it defers visible bond pain. It is dangerous because it socializes the hidden costs through the currency. The source says the likely path is exactly this: more money creation into an oil spike, and warns that the inflation that follows could make the last cycle look mild if the shock is deep enough and the printing large enough. Phaephilosite, Phaeturn 65, File 0, Phay. I do not need to endorse every numerical forecast to understand the direction. Print into an energy shock and the politics get hotter later, even if the market calms first. That is how the creditor grid defends itself. It turns a visible financing problem into a slower public purchasing power problem. Now let us take the third path seriously. Withdrawal, back away. Declare victory, move on. Pretend the mission was narrower than it looked. This is the least discussed monetary path and perhaps the most symbolically important. The source says that if the United States starts a confrontation but fails to reopen the core shipping lane convincingly, the rest of the world may begin reading that as a modern Suez moment, a sign not only of a temporary stumble but of waning imperial credibility. It says such a move could accelerate the willingness of countries to price oil and trade outside the dollar system. Phaephilosite, Phaeturn 65, File 0, Phay. That is a huge claim. But directionally, it captures something important. Reserve systems are not backed only by spreadsheets. They are backed by force, confidence, and the belief that the issuer can maintain order around the system that prices the world. If the belief erodes, the creditor grid does not disappear overnight, but the world starts seeking alternatives more urgently. That is the point. Not that one retreat erases the dollar tomorrow, that every visible stumble changes marginal behavior, and reserve systems die at the margin before they die in the headlines. So all three paths share something in common. They are inflationary in one way or another, either through market pain and lower confidence, through money creation, or through geopolitical trust erosion and a weaker dollar. That is why the source keeps repeating that every road leads toward some form of inflationary pressure and broader systemic instability. Phaephilosite, Phaeturn 65, File 0, Phay. Now, that by itself would already be enough to make this an important script. But the source goes further. It says, the real opportunity for the people closest to power comes after the crisis, not before it. That is where the creditor grid becomes more than a debt story. It becomes a control story. I want to be careful here because this is where many people either become uncritically credulous or reflexively dismissive. I am interested in structure, not theatrics. The source says crises have repeatedly been used as opportunities to increase centralization of wealth and power, citing the post-2008 response, the post-2020 response, and the language of reset that surrounded those years. It explicitly says it does not imagine a cartoon room of 12 evil planners, but argues that crises consistently give powerful institutions permission to redesign systems in more centralized ways. Phaephilosite, Phaeturn 65, File 0, Phay. That is a much more intelligent frame than the cartoon. I do not need a secret room to understand incentive concentration. If a crisis creates political permission, the people already near the levers of the system will shape the redesign. That is how institutions behave. That is not fantasy. That is bureaucracy plus opportunity. Now let us add the second great pressure. The source identifies automation. It says AI and automation could displace large numbers of workers. Even if the optimistic story of abundance turns out true, the transition would still produce an enormous governance problem. Large populations with less labor income, more free time, and greater dependence on distribution systems create pressure for some form of universal support mechanism. Felicite Fayturn 65 File 0 Fe. That is not an outlandish observation. It is perfectly plausible. And once you combine that with the debt problem, the next design challenge becomes obvious. How do you fund the state, distribute support, and preserve control all at once? That is the real question at the center of the script. The source S answer is blunt. It imagines a system in which debt gets privatized outward and distributed through digital corporate wallets, stablecoins, and app-based financial channels, so that ordinary people across the world, often unknowingly, become creditors to U.S. government debt while also becoming more tightly integrated into a programmable monetary grid. Felicite Fayturn 65 File 0 Fe. This is the part that most people will either wave away too quickly or swallow too literally. I prefer a narrower, more disciplined reading. I do not need to know the final shape to see the direction of travel. The direction is clear enough. Money is becoming more app-mediated. Corporate ecosystems want to become financial ecosystems. Stable coins and tokenized claims are increasingly being attached to Treasury collateral. Governments like funding channels that deepen demand for their paper, platforms like data, states like programmability. That combination is real, whether one uses maximal language about control grids or not. The source points to Tether, large Treasury holdings, and to pending legislation requiring stablecoin issuers to back their tokens with treasuries or similar safe assets. It then extrapolates from that into a future where large consumer brands, platforms, and wallets become distribution channels for government debt at global scale. Felicite Fayturn 65 File 0 Fe. That is the creditor grid in its modern form, not a bank branch on every corner, a brand on every phone, not a bond salesman, a wallet interface, not patriotic bond posters, a rewards tab. That is how the 21st century finances itself when the old channels are under strain. It makes debt feel like convenience. And convenience is the most powerful salesman in the world. I do not know exactly how far and how fast that process will go. But I do know this: if a system can solve three problems at once, by routing debt demand through consumer technology, it will be strongly tempted to try. The three problems are obvious. Fund government debt, provide rails for support payments, increase visibility and control over transactions. That is a seductive architecture for any state under debt pressure. The source presents this as a full-spectrum financial control grid, even arguing that corporations, not just governments, could become quasi-bank distributors of state debt, and that wallets could become points of conditional access. Felicite Fayturn 65 File 0 Fe. Again, I do not need to adopt every maximal implication to take the structure seriously. All I need to see is that the line between payment system, savings vehicle, loyalty mechanism, and government funding rail is getting thinner. That is enough. And when lines get thinner, optionality matters more, which brings me to the most useful part of the whole source preparation. It says one sensible response is to secure real assets, use cash, build local resilience, improve skills, and favor self. Custody over layers of institutional dependence where possible. It specifically mentions holding physical forms of some assets rather than only ETF or custodial claims, and says the core idea is to keep at least part of your life outside the most programmable version of the grid. Felicite Fayturn 65 File 0 Fe. That, to me, is where the script becomes practical. Because whether or not the future arrives in the most dramatic way the source imagines, the preparation logic still holds. When debt is large, when war pressure rises, when oil matters, when money creation becomes more likely, when state and corporate rails merge more tightly, and when technology makes transactions easier to monitor and condition, the ordinary person should ask a few simple questions. How much of my balance sheet depends on one institution behaving well? How much of my life depends on digital convenience? Never turning conditional. How much of my savings exists only as a claim inside other people? S systems. How much resilience do I have in forms that do not require a functioning mood in the market every day to remain valuable? How much of my future depends on policymakers choosing the least painful path? For me personally, those are adult questions. The Source S answer leans toward physical gold, self-custodied Bitcoin, local resilience, and asset control outside the most centralized rails. Fay Falicite Fay Turn 65, File 0 Fay. My own instinct is broader and perhaps calmer in tone, but not different in spirit. Own real things, own productive things, own some liquidity, understand custody, reduce fragility. Do not let all your wealth exist only as permissioned entries inside systems you barely understand. That is not paranoia, that is balance. Sheet adulthood. Now let me say something hard. Most people want safety and convenience at the same time, and they want both delivered by systems whose incentives they do not study. That is how dependency is built. Dependency rarely arrives by force first. It arrives by ease. Click here, tap here, yield here, rewards here, protection here, insurance here, backstop here. It all feels like kindness until the day the kindness becomes conditional. That is why I keep returning to the phrase creditor grid, because a grid is helpful right up until you remember that something connected to a grid can also be turned off. That is not an argument against technology. It is an argument for optionality. Now let me tell you the deepest thing in the whole source. It is not really about war. It is not really about CBDCs or stablecoins as isolated topics. It is about what happens when an empire with a gigantic debt load, a reserve currency, a rising energy shock, and a technological opportunity to redesign money all hit the same historical moment. That is what gives this script its force. The source frames that moment as both a crisis and an opportunity for central planners to upgrade the system in a more centralized direction. Fay Falicite Fay Turn 65 File 0. Fay perhaps. What I would say is this: crises do not guarantee a planned redesign, but they do create the permission, the demand, and the fear under which redesign becomes much easier to sell. That is enough reason to take the possibility seriously. So here is the final choice. You can keep looking at this war as only another geopolitical headline and this debt problem as only another Washington argument and this digital money discussion as only another tech policy debate, or you can see the harder and more useful truth. These are not separate stories. They are connected by the creditor grid. Oil pressure forces dollar demand. Dollar demand triggers asset selling. Asset selling pressures yields. Yield pressure forces policy choices. Policy choices favor printing or retreat or recession. And the redesign that follows will likely try to solve debt distribution and control in one move. That is the sequence. Not because some scriptwriter controls every frame, because incentives have gravity, and gravity pulls institutions towards solutions that preserve themselves first. That is why I do not ask only what happens next in the war. I ask what kind of monetary architecture becomes easier to sell after the next round of stress. That is the adult question. And if you ask it now before the average person does, you have time to do the only thing that really matters. Strengthen your position, not with hysteria, not with fantasies, with structure. Because when the creditor grid gets tighter, the people who come through strongest are usually the ones who understood early that debt war, money apps, and custody were never separate topics at all. They were parts of the same machine. And once you see the machine, you stop treating convenience as safety and start building a life that can survive even when the rails themselves begin to change.